So welcome to one of the research panels for the symposium. This is General Issues in CivMil, and we have three very exciting presentations for you. I don't want to take up too much time because it's quite tight, but the way that this will work is that folks will give their presentation and then they'll take questions and answers for about 15 minutes or however much is left after they've presented, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. So yeah, welcome. And our first presenters will be Henrique Garbino and Jonathan Robinson. And they have some other colleagues who've helped out, but they're presenting the research on their behalf.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all again. And yeah, presenting with Henrique. I haven't seen Henrique since 2019, since we lived in Beirut together. So it's very nice to be connected in person once again. So today, yeah, we're going to cover a research project that we're doing at Brown University's Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies through one of their seed grants that they got and kindly provided us to do this research project. Just before we start, my day job, I work at the Naval War College's Humanitarian Response Program. So like probably a lot of you in the room, I have to give the caveat that this is very much my own views, opinions, not anything official or anything like that. So just to kind of, put that on the page there. But just to kind of start off, I guess, and I'll let Henrique introduce himself when he does his portion. But just to set off, we're going to just introduce kind of where the project came from, a quick literature review of some of the previous kind of publications and any gaps in that we've identified, and then really dive down into the project that we're doing, which is really looking at mapping different approaches to civil-military interaction, coordination, cooperation. This is why the project's called Civil Military What, because what is it? So there's many different views there. And so when we started looking at the different concepts and the different approaches, we started seeing that there's a lot out there, is the short answer. Our project so far has looked at around 24 different approaches from different countries around the world and different organizations. And so we can really see that, there are similar ones, coordination, cooperation, US Army Civil Affairs, there's a lot of similarities there. But there are also some differences in some of these approaches and frameworks. And so we really wanted to get down a little bit more to really understand, these multitude of different civil-military concepts and approaches and frameworks. And is there a way of looking at them as a whole? Is there a way of categorizing them, mapping them, seeing what's out there, basically? And this is just another example of other concepts there. So really kind of, what is it? And so our project had two aims. It was first to map, what's out there, civil-military interaction, cooperation, coordination, different documents, everything from the EU, NATO, to individual nations, to individual service branches. And then, really apply the method that we came up with to help compare and contrast between those approaches. Hopefully, does this make sense so far? Is this, people are still with me? Good, excellent. It's always nice. It's always worrying being the first one after lunch in case people have got that kind of post-lunch kind of sleep, but I'm glad we're still with us. But yeah, as I mentioned, very much kind of possible by the seed grant that the center gave us here. So any other budding researchers, please do think about getting seed grants from the center here as well. So when we started looking at different previous publications on the issue, there's been a lot published out there. The Australian Civil Military Center has done an excellent guide looking at the different languages and looking at different organizations. And you can see other reports there that have also looked at this topic. But we found that often many of these haven't necessarily looked at the whole problem as a whole. They either focus on specific concepts or approaches, be it kind of EU versus UN or, looking at US versus NATO or something like this. So we wanted to kind of step back a little bit from that and look at things as a whole. And so we really wanted to look if there was a way of mapping these approaches, frameworks, doctrines, reports, whatever you want to call it, because, even I'm struggling to kind of talk about it. And that's also, I think, a highlight of the vast spectrum that's out there of this approach. And then we also wanted to come up with a simple way and a method that we can apply to all of these concepts, approaches, doctrines, frameworks, to be able to compare and contrast against them. And so that's what we've been doing. And so what is that framework? What is that way of comparing and contrasting them? So we took, in effect, 4 different categories to then apply to each concept or document that we found. And so the first one was kind of, certainly looking at what's its perspective. And I'll talk about that in a second. Also, kind of, is it focused internally or externally? Is it for an internal audience? Is it for an external audience? Is it for both? We also wanted to look at the level. Is it for the strategic level, decision makers, or is it kind of at the operational, tactical? Is it all of them? And so we were looking at those kind of things. And then finally, with the structure, we were looking, does it have dedicated personnel and functions associated with this? Or is it a standalone document and it's forgotten about forevermore? So we really wanted to understand what this looked like. So with the perspective, we looked at, is this document or framework or approach that we found, is it from a military perspective and talking about a civilian audience that it's trying to connect with? Or is it, like the UN, from a civilian perspective and thinking about military actors around it, for example? Or is it both? Does it speak to both internal aspects and civilian kind of military aspects? Same with the focus. We looked at kind of that inward focus, outward focus as well. And then we also looked at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels to see where each concept and approach fits. And then finally, is it dedicated personnel, structures and resources, or is it principles? And so when we started looking at these kind of things, we started seeing that there were, in effect, kind of 4 main archetypes that you could kind of look at when you started applying this method to different concepts. And so this is just a visualization of that. And so we thought maybe other ones that we found could fit into those archetypes. Does Brazil's civil military concept fit into one of those? Does the African Union's civil military concept fit into one of those? So we really wanted to test that idea and understand if it was possible, or are there other archetypes to find outside of that? But I'll maybe stop there and pass it over to Henrique to continue on of how we then kind of map these different concepts. And we're happy to take questions, I think, probably at the end after we've kind of talked about this. But I hope you're still with me so far and we're making sense. But thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for coming here today, and a pleasure to be here. I'm coming from the Swedish Defense University, and if you're wondering what that funny little name on the top left corner is, that's what it means. Or Defense University. And just continue here, I think it's good to explain a little bit more what we mean by these different archetypes. So civil-military relations, we consider it more like the Huntingtonian version of it, like the political science concept, like democratic control of armed forces, like the more internal, strategic level relations between civilian and military authorities. Civil-military interaction, we consider the shared, everyday routine interaction at the field level between civilians and militaries, not specialized. So a soldier going to a checkpoint, or a civilian going to a checkpoint and talking to a soldier, that would be a civil-military interaction. CIMIC and CIMCORD being the military and civilian humanitarian versions of that. But then specialized personnel in charge of that function, in charge of that role. And these archetypes we got from analyzing the main multilateral organizations, so the concepts used by the UN, EU, NATO, and the US. As an outlier in the multilateral organization, but due to its relevance, of course. So then how did we come about? It's still an ongoing project, so we're still collecting data, and we are a team of 4, and together we kind of are looking into sources into 8 different languages. And the countries in dark blue are countries which concepts we have already collected and analyzed, and those are we know to a certain level of confidence that there's no concept. Also, our no findings are findings as well. So countries that haven't operationalized civil-military relations in their organizations. And the light blue ones are those that we are still doing research on that, and we aim to find something sooner. And also between the four of us, we have been deployed to UN missions, NATO units, European Union, NGOs, Red Cross movement, humanitarian and military experiences. So we are trying to cover a considerable ground with our team composition. And not only looking into multilateral organizations and government agencies, but also NGOs and even non-state groups, if they have these kind of concepts. And one of the outputs is to summarize these concepts into fact sheets. So, for example, if I am a CIMIC officer, Civil Military Cooperation officer from the Belgian Armed Forces, and I'm deployed to Congo for some kind of a military cooperation, then they can take up this fact sheet and look at, how does Congo organize their civil-military relations? Or I'm going to deploy and we're going to work side by side with World Vision. And how do they organize the civil-military relations? So this is the idea. Have also an organogram with the focal people in the organizational structure and so on, so it's easily pinpointed for the practitioner. And here is what we're trying to, you're not supposed to be reading this, but I think you can in the big screen. We're kind of organizing each specific concept, putting them into this matrix. So depending on their values for each variable. Again, the archetypes are not all the possible combinations of these variables, right? But they are the ones concepts that already exist. And so far, we have been able to fit every concept into one of the archetypes. There's no, so far, outlying concept. And some preliminary findings so far is that most concepts come from military organizations. So there's more interest or more energy put into organizing civil-military relations from a conceptual perspective by the military. Doesn't mean that our civilian organizations don't do it, but maybe they do it differently. For example, through terms of references in their positions. The civilian concepts are most likely humanitarian. We haven't come up with any political civilian military concept except for the strategic level civil-military relations, for example. Most concepts are under the civil-military relations, like strategic level, or CIMIC, the military variant at the tactical and operational levels. And only one organization has this civil-military interaction concept, in the sense that it's a non-dedicated function, valid for all members of the organization at all times, and that's NATO. And there are also many countries, many organizations that have no clear, at least not easily accessible doctrine or concept policy on civil-military relations. So we've looked into only open sources, but even then, when we reach our networks, when we ask around, it's hard to prove the organization doesn't have them, but we're pretty sure. Yeah, we try hard when we don't find something. And yeah, so then why? Is it any worth? Is it worth the effort? What good does it bring, right? So then we have two proofs of concept that we're trying to prove the validity or the value of this project. And the first one is to identify conceptual gaps. So here we're going to do a very quick analysis of concepts used by the UN, the European Union, and NATO. So UN has these three concepts. So UN CIMIC, Civil Military Coordination, CIMCORD, Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination, and WFP has the same Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination or Humanitarian Military Interaction, depending which document you look at. And they follow the archetypes of CIMIC and CIMCORD, as you can see in the table here. And yeah, mostly at the operational tactical level. CIMIC, UN CIMIC is both looking inward within a peacekeeping operation, so coordination between the components, military, civilian, and police components, but also with civilian actors outside the UN mission. UNSIMCORD, we code it as also looking internally and externally, because from the UN perspective, coordination between, for example, OCHA and military peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, blue helmets, it will be an internal coordination in a way. But it depends how you interpret it as well. And WFP components or concepts, it's only outwards. It's only with military personnel outside the organization. And all of them have dedicated personnel. The European Union has two concepts: civil-military coordination and civil-military cooperation. Cooperation is the military CIMIC version, not much more about it. And the CMCO is a civil-military relations concept. So focus at the strategic level, coordination between the military and civilian bodies within the EU in Brussels. So it's a headquarters concept. There's no one in charge for that. It's just a policy that can be followed or not. NATO has two concepts, CMI and CIMIC. Both are military-oriented, of course, focused on external civilian actors, even though NATO has civilian staff. And they're both present at all levels, from strategic to tactical level. CMI is general policy, and CIMIC is a military function, right, with staff, resources, budget, units, and whatnot. So here, the proof of concept that we can see which concepts are missing for these organizations. So for the UN, for example, there is no concept to organizing civil-military relations in New York at the headquarters level, for example, or the different levels. There is no civilian political concept. There's a humanitarian one, but not a civilian political one. And nothing at the strategic level, basically. The EU, similar gaps. NATO, similar gaps as well. So here, it's just an example of how we can use this approach at different levels. We could apply the same logic into US government policies and concepts as well, for example. Another way to test the validity of this analysis or this analytical framework is to foresee practical challenges. And here I mean when one organization interacts with another, or when, for example, one organization is embedded into another. For example, country X deploying to a multilateral mission or coalition of forces, NATO operations, UN operations, EU operations. So the first challenge is strategic guidance. So let's say, for example, a CIMIC officer in a NATO context is used to receiving strategic guidance because there is a J9 strategic level civil military cooperation branch planning cell at the headquarters of NATO at the strategic level. But when this same individual deploys to a UN mission, then he or she is going to have to sort it out themselves at the mission level because there's not going to be any strategic guidance for them. One example. Or difference in focus. Again, the same NATO officer being used to only looking outwards for coordination, only looking at external civilian actors. When deploying to a peacekeeping mission, UN peacekeeping, maybe they're going to miss the internal coordination component, which is much more relevant in a UN mission, which is multidimensional, for example. Third one, dedicated function. If I am a military commander from, I don't know, Bangladesh, and there is no civil military concept in the Bangladeshi army, then when I'm force commander in a UN peacekeeping mission, maybe this general won't value the CIMIC branch as much because of this lack of organizational thinking or culture. And finally, if I know that the civilian organization I'm interacting with doesn't have a dedicated civil-military coordination function or CIMCORD function, then I might need to plan how to interact them in a more ad hoc way. I might have to identify key individuals made based on personalities or whatnot. So I don't have one single focal point easy to identify. And I can plan that ahead of time because I know that civilian organization X or Y doesn't have a clear organization for that. So these are just different ways we can use this analytical tool to help ourselves in the future. And so this is an ongoing project, and for now we have in our to-do list to really finalize the data collection as soon as possible. It's been dragging for a while, honestly, and organize all the data we have. It's a lot of information, and the idea is to create a repository on an online database where people can just find the original documents, and of course our fact sheets with the summaries, but everything is there and can be updated as concepts change and evolve. Publish the research report with the center here, and of course receive feedback from you. So the idea is to have this be a useful tool, not both for practitioners but also for academia and policymakers. So also because this problem of conceptual differences, it's a mess at the organizational level. In academia, it's even worse. How the concepts are created and reinvented, with much less consistency. So the idea is to really use it and put it for trial, basically. And our main gaps, I think, is that we're not covering police-related concepts, and that's a gray zone that tilts to the civilian side sometimes or to the military other times. So it's a bit hard, and we kind of took the easy way out and ignored it. True. And, but also there are many different questions that came up during the research. So here are some examples. I'm going to read them, but there is variation in some countries in this region. They are more likely to have civil-military relations organized in a specific way. So is there an influence between strategic level concepts to tactical level concepts within the same organization? So why, for example, does OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, doesn't have a clear policy on that? Should they? Is there a kind of a political constraints that limit this? So these are several different questions that came up when working with the project. And again, we welcome feedback from you, questions, challenges to our framework, and I hope it's useful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we're happy to take questions, feedbacks, comments. You know, we're still very much, you know, trying to kind of evolve this project, and you know, we're not saying this is the only way of doing it, or this is, you know, the only interpretation of these things. But yeah, we're happy to take questions or comments about the project. Thank you.
One thing that I won't bore everyone with here, let's chat after this about some of the data you had about AID, because like all things, we made things way too complicated, so I want to make sure you guys get the full picture. I like the idea that, you know, this is like a resource that people can pull something off the shelf. I also understand in academia funding is not infinite, either in terms of quantity or duration. So is it like, are you planning on updating this until date X or something like that? Or like what's the expiration date on something like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, yeah, thanks for the offer as well to kind of keep us updated. You know, we're only as good as what we're finding. And, you know, this has been an ongoing project. And Henrique and I have talked about this project for, I want to say, like 3 years now or something. So, you know, some of our data we recognize is dated. But no, our hope was certainly to kind of keep this an ongoing living project. I think with the first kind of iteration of the repository and the final report, definitely by the end of this year, that has to be done. But then our hope is to kind of keep that alive and updated with future funding and opportunities. Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah, oh yeah.
In the past, especially in the Americas and the Asia Pacific region, you know, we have talked about civil-military relations per se for our organization. Our organization doesn't do CIMIC, doesn't do CIMIC. We deal strictly with civil-military relations. How do you put that into your entire concept? Also, just to let you know that we did a work in 2018, sorry, in Peru, and we do have a small repository that you guys might want to look into for the Americas, so that you could
That would be great.
also look into.
I'll let you take that one.
Yeah. Is it working? Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we're looking into ICRC and the concepts they use or don't use for that. And I think I mentioned that if, for example, ICRC doesn't have a, as far as you know, doesn't have a operational concept for engaging with the military. Does it mean that ICRC is not doing their job well in terms of relating with the military? No, right? There are other ways to do that. And that's something we explore in the draft report. And how do they do it? Like sharing roles and responsibilities within the organization structure. You have the heads of delegation, for example, or the armed forces delegates, protection delegates. They have in their TORs their responsibilities to engage with the military in this way, or promote IHL, or I don't know, the conduct of hostilities reports and whatnot. So there are different ways to do the same thing without calling it CIMIC or SIMCORD. And that's something we explore in the report. Yeah.
Since 2018, the ICRC and the IFRC as a movement developed the CMR project in order to be able to have that, not only for the ICRC per se, but to work as a movement in the civil military arena and between the militaries, the governments, because sometimes when we talk about civil militaries, civil entities also and governments, and the humanitarian realm. So I definitely offer you in touch later on.
No, for sure, for sure. Yeah, so this the CMR concept in our framework would fit our CMR as well, so the strategic level engagement. But from our understanding, the movement lacks a tactical level concept because it's embedded in other frameworks within the organization, and that doesn't mean it's bad, not at all. Yeah. Please.
Hi, Jules Frost, Australian Civil Military Center, and I just want to thank you guys. I think conceptually, I really appreciate the framework and that you've taken this on, because as I was trying to do this within the update of the Same Space, Different Mandates publication, which you can get a copy and there's a poster on out there, it was, how do you document all the different ways that people call something that they think is always the same. And the fact that you're highlighting that it's different and how you've done that, I think is very helpful. Because what we do know when we're getting together as practitioners, if you're not aware of what SIMCORD means and you're a CIMIC guy, you assume, or gal, that it means the same thing. And that's where then it raises expectations that then aren't fulfilled and can have negative impact on trusted relationships, which we heard from our previous session is one of the most important concepts. So if we can help populate this further and promote this kind of awareness and understanding, I think it is a good contribution to increasing understanding and awareness and how we can work together to have the best outcome in these situations. So thank you for that.
Just a quick feedback. I think our ambition is to have the buy-in of their, like the custodian organizations that coined each concept, have NATO to be on the board, UN, OCHA, DPO. So then they would check our facts and update when necessary, so we can have this ongoing effort. That would be our ambition, and yeah, we count on your support. Catherine?
Okay, so Catherine Kramer from Interaction. Question on that is, I mean, obviously it's across the board, there's a whole bunch of different things there, but I'm wondering where it comes down to, like, have you looked at that in terms of decision-making? Authority within who is staffing those positions or who is participating in those those areas, because I think that's, depending on what you're talking about, with whom, you want to know who actually has the decision-making authority, and it could be that whoever is in that civ-mil position does not actually have that authority, and then how is it that those decision-making either direction can get to the right people, and is that actually the best transit point to get to decision makers on either side?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you've looked at that in your research.
Yeah, that's. Do you want me to take it? Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you know, at the moment our plan was to keep it kind of high level and just with those 4 frameworks, just because it keeps us busy enough with just looking at those 4 topics. But certainly to add on to kind of our categories, we're not, you know, against that. And certainly for those, you know, concepts, frameworks, approaches that do have dedicated functions, because remember, not all of them have, some of them just have a document and that's it. But yeah, certainly whether, you know, that could be an interesting kind of, you know, addition to kind of dive down in that future research. But at our current level, we haven't looked at that level. But no, thanks. That's a good point and feedback. Thank you. Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'm not keeping track. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Of the order.
I know. Yeah, it's hard to kind of see. But yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
In looking at it, whether the context was considered, for instance, either conflict or disaster management. Yeah.
I can take that. And we try to be as broad as possible. So, yeah, looking into internal responses to natural disasters or internal interagency coordination. What we excluded was military to military cooperation and civilian to civilian cooperation, or coordination, whatever you want to call it. So if it's civil military, then we would include. And it can be for peacetime, regular day-to-day activities, or war. So the whole spectrum.
Yeah. And then I think one here and then one, yeah.
So I echo Jules' compliments about seeing something consolidated that's never been done before. And I may have been, but to the point of the question, I may have missed it in your matrices, but are you also looking for whether or not an organization executes the policy that they place? Because I'm sure all of us have worked with at least a bureaucracy that has policies and frameworks and they don't use them. Or conversely, organizations that have a physical, regularly utilized opportunity of interaction or coordination in a certain way, they just haven't codified it.
Well, the answer is no. We're looking, it's a conceptual analysis more than anything. We're not going to the implementation. And if they do something but haven't been put on paper or being out there as official document, we would include. There was, for example, one terminology issue with WFP that we could only find the official policy, at least publicly, on humanitarian civil military coordination. But there are a lot of people being employed as humanitarian military interaction officers. But we haven't found anything written on that. So this is just one example.
Right here.
First. Yeah, do you want to, yeah.
We can come in a minute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mohammed from the Nigeria NGO Forum. And I maybe jumping off the point from the colleague from Interaction and from you, Jonathan, that if there is in your analysis a way to at least identify or try to understand why some policies do exist but actually are not operationalized. I had a question if at further points you would try to take a look at some policies that exist on engagement with NSACs, for example, or other paramilitary or other security or armed actors in any context that are not purely military. And finally, maybe one comment or suggestion. When, for example, considering the UN, we have a multitude of actors, whether UN or NGOs, between humanitarian actors, development actors, and peacekeeping actors, or peace-building actors as well, so that's a fourth category, that are all bound by very, very different principles, that have very, very different modus operandi in the field, and that would definitely lead to different concepts in engage it with the different armed actors. And I don't know to what extent these differences would fit into the the matrix of the four archetypes?
No, thank you. Yeah, good questions. And certainly, where, organizations, particularly not humanitarian NGOs, have looked at, say, civil military interaction with non-state armed groups, we've tried to capture that. We've classified that as an armed actor, a military actor. But there's not a lot out there. It still kind of seems to be, there's different organizations that have kind of written down approaches, frameworks, concepts, but then there are other organizations that haven't. But obviously, from our experience, we know they do that. And so, we do recognize that there is a limitation there with that. We kept it kind of narrow, but certainly to your point about peace-building organizations, conflict resolution organizations, you could even put development actors into that as well. Obviously, you could keep going, civil society, so on and so forth. But again, we do, Henrique and I are both doing this project in our spare time, so we only have a limited ability to do this. So we had to narrow and give ourselves some guide rails. But certainly your point is taken, and some of the questions that I've heard already are almost kind of how we've thought about taking it to the next level. So it's great that people are with us also thinking about the next level and the next step, which is great. But yeah, WFP, do you want to say something?
No, I'd never have Peanut gallery. No, first of all, I think it's a great piece of work, guys. I think it's super interesting. I took lots of pictures. First of all, I think we should probably have a conversation just to clarify the WFP component, because there's things that are public documents that WFP has approved years ago, because depending on the level of approvals required, it may go to nations and things like that. So it's easier for us not to go for the highest level sort of policy document. And there was also a bit of evolution, right? So once we feel like we know what we're actually trying to do, then we will come out with a document.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation to clarify a few things. So there is only one concept, I'll clarify that, so we can fix that for you. But I think it's super useful, and I think it'd be interesting to dive bilaterally into some of the terminology, because I do think there's a split between what the OCHA colleagues have done over the last 20 years, what they're going to do for the next 20 years, and how WFP slots into that, as well as some of the other funds, agency funds and programs. So it'd be great to have a chat.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're happy to receive that feedback, because we're only as good as the sources we're getting and covering, and so always happy to update and receive. Hey, you got the wrong one here, maybe update it with this one. So we're happy to have that. So
Thank you.
I think we got one here.
Hi, my name is Mike Delaney. I work with Crescendo International, it's a small consulting group. I guess this goes along the lines of maybe next steps or future thinking. But I just was curious, in terms of on the civilian side, you had the international, mostly international organizations there. And really since 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit, there's been a lot of push for more localization and local organizations. And I just wanted to know if you considered that, or you're thinking about that, or there were some examples that you came across in terms of that collaboration with local and or national organizations.
Thank you for the question. And we have discussed this, and I'm Brazilian, and we have in Brazil like 26 different civilian police forces, 26 military police forces, 26 firefighter departments, a couple of federal polices, and each one of them could have their own civilian military police coordination concept, right? So at some point we decided that we should stick to the federal or national level in terms of national organizations. So if it's an NGO, a civil society organization active at the national and or international level, we would consider including it. But in our data collection planning process, we selected some target countries to look at, to be representative of history, region, and other factors. Some major international organizations and NGOs, and also major multilateral organizations, government organizations. And so if, let's say, Nigeria is one of these countries, and Brazil and Mexico are countries like that. So if these countries have organizations that they would pop up in our search, then we would include. But we wouldn't dig too deep into that, also because of the limitation of resources, basically. And we're not trying to be comprehensive, but to get a wide set of concepts so we can see if the framework works, basically. But definitely that's something really important. And yeah, something at least important to work with the organizations and see if they even need that, right? Yeah.
And something we're going to definitely, you know, could be another iteration of the project as well. But yeah,
maybe focus on one region or one country and then dig deeper into that, something like that.
Yeah. Oh wow, that caused a lot of questions. Yeah, who's next?
I think it's a very good question, and where I'm seeing a key role in engaging is at the National Disaster Management Organization, because they play a role often in the center between the military of a country, the police, the civil national NGOs, maybe the National Society of the Red Cross, and how the NDMO would see at a national level their civil military interaction, engagement, or coordination with the movement towards localization of humanitarian response, I think will be really important. And so how do we look at national level, if you take your framework from the CIMIC, the SIMCORD, the CMR, and how that's being translated at a national level, I think it'll help us. Because right now I'm trying to help the Australian Defence Force when they deploy overseas to say, you may not be engaging with the Australian international humanitarians that you normally did. They're going to be representative from Papua New Guinea that are going to want to relate with you. And how do we prepare both sides to be able to understand each other in that? So your framework may be able to be modified to also address that.
No, thank you. And, you know, I'm happy to keep this discussion going on. I'm glad it's generated discussion. That's always nice to know that we're kind of on the mark if we're managing to get questions back to us. But I think, unfortunately, time's against us. And I definitely don't want to eat into Rob Grace's kind of time with his excellent presentation. So maybe we'll finish there for us. And then if you want to kind of grab us at the break, we're happy to kind of keep these conversations going. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We'll add the reception is a new addition to the research symposium, and it is meant for these issues. Okay, so thank you so much. Our next presentation will be by Dr. Rob Grace, and it is titled Understanding Humanitarian Access Obstruction, Evidence from a New Dataset. So please, do you need water or something? You got it, perfect. So just normal slide progression.
Okay, cool, thanks.
I'll get your name tag.
Okay, so I'm going to be presenting a data set on humanitarian access obstruction. This data set is part of a broader book project that I'm working on humanitarian access negotiation that builds on my dissertation that I completed here at Brown University just last year. But that's all to say that this remains a work in progress right now. So I very much welcome critical feedback. So I'm hoping we'll have time in the Q&A to talk about it, and I can hear from you what you don't buy about how I approached this. And I just want to stress that I want to hear from you now about what you think doesn't work about the data set. I do not want to hear from you when the book has been published and it's too late for me to change anything about it. So please make my book not bad. That's my appeal to you here in this presentation. So the impetus for what I'm doing is that for humanitarian negotiation, and specifically humanitarian access negotiation, is that there's a puzzle of generalizability. This is something I wrote about in an article I published a few years ago when I was a fellow at the Harvard program on negotiation. Basically what I mean by that is that humanitarian workers, as they're negotiating for access in different contexts, often struggle to understand in what ways they can learn lessons from their past experiences to apply forward to their future experiences. In some ways, different contexts might be similar to one another, but in some ways, they might be incredibly different from one another. And there is a lot of uncertainty about how to understand those similarities and differences. But we do know a couple things already. We know that humanitarian negotiation is not like this. An approach to humanitarian negotiation and guidance or a handbook will never be like a cookbook or a recipe for humanitarian negotiation. A humanitarian negotiator is not a chef like this person we see here, and you cannot follow particular instructions that you know will result in a tasty looking dish like this chef has here there. You cannot be always certain that that will happen. So humanitarian negotiation is not like that. It's not a cookie cutter type of situation. But on the other end of the spectrum, there also is a sense, perhaps, that it is not possible to know what lessons you can learn from past experiences and to carry them forward into future experiences, because each context is different. So you never know how some context is going to play out. You never really know what thing led to a certain outcome when you're negotiating for access in a particular context. So there's a sense of agnosticism about that. And I have Rene Descartes here of I think, therefore I am fame, because I think we can take it to an extreme and say it might also be possible that we can't prove actually that anything actually exists outside of our own mind. And I actually think that philosophically that's true, I agree with it, but I do think that it is not how we should look at humanitarian negotiation. I don't think it's a useful way to look at it. I think that the way we want to look at it lies in the middle of these two extremes, that we can learn some lessons about past experiences, and if these lessons are rooted in a sound analysis of empirical data, we can have some understanding of how to apply them to other contexts with appropriate scoping conditions. But we still have this problem with humanitarian negotiation, and specifically humanitarian access obstruction, that there's been a lack of data on humanitarian access, and there remains a lack of data on humanitarian access, even over the past couple decades when a lot of people and organizations have been really into humanitarian negotiation, me being one of them. So there has been a need for a data set on humanitarian access obstruction to fill this gap. There is data out there. It's not like there's no data out there. But the data that has been out there, in terms of a data set, has not been usable for this purpose. Any data set on humanitarian access obstruction, we will want to have it do three things, ideally. One, we will want it to encompass a wide array of types of access obstruction. We want to get the full access obstruction picture, ideally. Two, we will want a data set that has an expansive geographic and temporal scope so that we can get a sense of what we're looking at, how it varies across contexts, how it varies across time. And three, we will want a data set that identifies perpetrators for all or most cases. We need to know who is the entity doing the access obstruction. If we do not know that in the data set, we cannot really draw conclusions about what led to the result of access obstruction or access facilitation. So there are many data sets that incorporate some of these issues. Here are a couple that you might know. ACAPS produces reports on humanitarian access. They do include a wide array of access obstruction types. ACAP's reports include 9 indicators across 3 different pillars of humanitarian access. They do not have an expansive temporal scope. They've been doing them for a few years. They do have an expansive geographic scope, but they do not identify perpetrators. So they're really not useful for trying to understand why it is that particular entities obstruct access or do not obstruct access. There's also the aid worker security database. Not a wide array of access types of access obstruction. They're just looking at security incidents for aid workers. The dataset does have an extensive geographic and temporal scope, but does not identify perpetrators, even for most cases. There is a column in the dataset for perpetrators, but the vast majority of them are missing the identity of the perpetrator. They're only there for approximately 35% of the incidents listed in the dataset. That's why I created a humanitarian access obstruction dataset that does all of these 3 things. Here's what I did. The dataset includes post 9/11 high-intensity civil wars. So I drew from an existing dataset, the Uppsala and Peace Research Institute Armed Conflict Dataset, and took every country year observation for which there were 1,000 battle-related deaths or more. So every country during that time span, and every year in which there were that many number of battle-related deaths or more. So that winds up being 22 countries, and it winds up being 105 country year observations. So there are 105 rows in the data set, and these are the countries, by the way. Those are the countries that you get if you follow this criteria. So the data set is just looking at civil war context. There are obviously other contexts in which there is access negotiation and access obstruction, but this data set, at least right now, in its current form, is just looking at civil war contexts. It also just includes governmental access obstruction at this point in time. I'm not looking at non-state armed groups. I'm not looking at other types of entities that might be responsible for access obstruction. For each of those contexts, for each of those country year observations, I'm just looking at the extent to which the government did or did not obstruct access. In terms of the types of organizations impacted, I'm just looking at the large, traditional, largely Western international humanitarian organizations. That is what the current data set includes. It includes a wide array of access incidents, including issues of getting into the country, visa issues, bureaucratic issues, and ability to operate within the country, as well as security incidents as well. It does not include some other types of issues for which it might be difficult to determine the extent to which the government is actually responsible for obstructing access or not. So I did not include issues of infrastructure or weather. I did not include issues of negotiations for, like multi-sided negotiations, if you're negotiating for a humanitarian corridor, if it involves the government, but you're also negotiating with other militaries or non-state armed groups. I did not include that in the data set. Again, the data set just includes incidents for which it is clear that the government was responsible for a certain type of access obstruction. And here's what I used for sources of data. I examined reports on ReliefWeb. For each of the country year observations that I included in the data set, I pulled all of the reports from ReliefWeb that include the term humanitarian access. There are 5,067 reports. For each of those reports, I coded each report 1 if it specifies government responsibility for an access delay or obstruction, and if it specified the organization type impacted. I coded it 0 if the report does not include that stuff. So for each country year observation, it has a number, the number of ReliefWeb reports that discuss governmental humanitarian access obstruction directed toward traditional Western international humanitarian organizations. Just want to specify this. The data set does not measure the extent to which humanitarian organizations have access to affected populations. It does not measure the extent to which the affected population has access to essential services. It is not a humanitarian access data set. It is a humanitarian access obstruction data set. It measures the extent to which a government obstructs activities that Western international humanitarian organizations are seeking to undertake. That is what the access obstruction data set does. The overall approach, I just want to specify this as well, is that the intent is that the data set will be crude but correct, not specific but imperfect, because it is still the case that data on humanitarian access is bad and incomplete, and there will always be a more incomplete, somewhat of an incomplete picture. And the more specific you try to make a data set, the more that incompleteness is going to potentially bias your data. So what I wanted to do was get a crude scale that accurately allows us to compare different contexts with one another. So that number of access obstruction reports, the idea is that number allows us to make a comparative assessment of, say, Syria in 2016 to Ukraine in 2015, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the approach to the data set. And here are some findings from the data set, because I want to try to understand what are the factors that are driving humanitarian access obstruction. So I'll show you a few figures that are sort of testing certain hypotheses about what might be shaping humanitarian access obstruction. Here's one. I'm comparing Western-aligned governments with non-Western aligned governments. We can see if this makes a difference. It could be the case that Western aligned governments obstruct access much less than governments that are not aligned with the West. And I measured this by arms sales. If a government receives arms from a Western state, I consider it to be aligned with the West. If it does not receive arms from the West, I consider that it is not aligned with the West. Here's what you get. It turns out it does make a big difference, at least according to my data set. The average number of access obstruction reports for Western-aligned governments is one report per country year observation. For non-Western-aligned governments, that number jumps to 9. A big difference between Western-aligned governments and non-Western-aligned governments. According to this analysis, international humanitarian organizations are more likely to encounter access obstruction with governments that are not aligned with the West. We can talk more about what that might mean if you buy this result in the Q&A, if you'd like to. But I will leave it at that for now, so we can look at some other things. Here's another one. I'm going to compare democratic versus non-democratic governments. And I pulled coding of what governments are democratic or not from an existing data set. Happy to talk about how that coding was done as well if it's of interest in the Q&A. But you might think that democratic governments will obstruct less than autocratic governments, because maybe democratic governments care more about the people in their country than autocratic governments do. Or maybe a democratic government cares more about liberal values in some way, that because of those norms that are embedded in democratic structures, that they will be less prone to obstruct humanitarian access. But that is not the case, at least according to my analysis. They're exactly the same. There's no difference between the propensity of democratic governments versus non-democratic governments to obstruct humanitarian access, at least according to my analysis. Here's a third one we can check out. I'm going to compare low-income countries to middle-income countries. We might think that this too makes a difference. There's a lot written in policy literature and political science literature about how command and control structures are important to monitor and enforce IHL, I'm sort of making an assumption that a middle-income country as opposed to a low-income country will have more state capacity, more command and control over the military. So we might expect to see less access obstruction in a middle-income country compared to a low-income country. That's what we would see if that expectation is correct. And it turns out it's sort of correct, but they're pretty much the same. The low-income countries and middle-income countries are pretty much the same. There's one, it changes by one number. It's a very small difference, but there is this small difference that you can observe. But they're pretty much the same, so you can kind of assume that at least when you're taking a bird's eye view of these data, you don't see a huge difference between low-income and middle-income countries. It could also be cool if we tested all of these factors together to see if we put them all together, which ones are driving the outcomes the most. And I did that. I'll show you the results. And I also included some other variables as well. And I did regression analysis. And just so you all know what we're looking for when I show you the regression table, just a slight statistics primer for anyone who might find it to be useful. What we're looking for is two things when we look at this table. What did you say? Stars. We're looking for stars. If there are stars next to the number, then that means it's statistically significant. So I have a number called align that's measuring Western alignment. So if there's a star next to the numbers on the alignment row, then that means that Western alignment is statistically significant, even if you take into consideration all the other factors that I'm throwing into the analysis. That's the first one. What's the second thing we're looking for? Smarty. Yes, we want to know the sign of the coefficient of the number. It needs to have an asterisk next to it for us to care about it at all. But if it has an asterisk next to it, then we also care about the sign. If on the alignment row, if it's positive, that means that as Western alignment goes up, access obstruction goes up. If it's negative, that means that as Western alignment goes up, access obstruction goes down. That's what we're looking for. We want a star, and then we want to look at the sign. Here's the table. Dun, 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 dun. There are only two variables for which there are stars. Alignment has stars in each of the models that I use. There are 5 different models. The second variable is battle-related deaths. Battle-related deaths is positive. So as battle-related deaths go up, access obstruction goes up. Perhaps not a surprising result, but as the intensity of a conflict increases, we should expect that the scale of access obstruction will also increase. And looking at the sign of alignment, it's negative. So that confirms what we saw before in the earlier graph, that as Western alignment goes up, access obstruction goes down. And there are other variables in there as well. Happy to elaborate on those more in the Q&A if people are curious, but I'm also happy to go into any question or area, or sort of dive deeper into any aspect of this that people might be interested in diving into. I think for now, I will leave it there and ask you for your reactions and your questions. And just stress again that now is the time that I want to hear from you. So tell me now, or we can also talk in a break, and you can also always contact me afterwards. The best way to contact me is probably on social media. Find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn. I'm the kind of person that is working at multiple institutions, and some of you might have an email for me, but I do not know how long whatever email you have for me will be active. So reach out to me on social media if you want to talk to me. Okay, you're up. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you do not buy about this. I want to know. I'm scared of what you're all going to say and ask, but I am also curious about it as well. So your hand up first. So I'll go to you first.
My name is Yuri. I'm with Humanitarian Negotiations Unit. So my question is, you were referring to limited data on humanitarian access. I'm just curious, did you have a chance to look into limited circulation of data? For example, context-specific databases that are particularly focused on humanitarian access impediments. And I mean, there are many organizations or many specific units or branches within organizations that are following it. Some do publish to limited circle, to humanitarians only, others keep it only to themselves. And I mean, for example, in the context of Afghanistan, I've seen a database that covers 12 years, including, as you were mentioning, the incidents where that were perpetrated by the government, as well as the incident perpetrated by the non-state armed groups and criminal elements, et cetera, et cetera. So from my experience, there is much more data on humanitarian access. The only problem is it's generally limited to humanitarian actors. So it's a kind of closed club that exchange information internally. So for your research, I think it would be really beneficial if you would be able to have access. Some organizations do publish these things limited, but it's more or less open source.
I agree. That would be super useful. But I did not incorporate that into this analysis, one reason being that is what I need for this to satisfy, you know, the political science people who will complain that I did not do things the right way. What I will need for this is data that encompasses all context for a certain period of time, or all context within certain scoping conditions that are consistent over time. So it could be that in some way, some country-specific data supplements what I found here, but it's not currently incorporated into it at this point in time. But maybe we should talk in the break. I will want to hear from you who I should be talking to make them give me their data. Some of them maybe are in this room. Okay, I see your hand up there.
Thank you so much, Rob. Great analysis, and a lot of work has gone into this. I just want to speak on your analysis of Western versus non-Western. You drew cognizance that you drew mostly from Relief Web, like you pointed out. You have to look at the context under which those data were pulled. Was mostly from non-Western location, was mostly from conflict area, was mostly from where humanitarian assistance delivery is carried out. It's not in the Western world, it's in the non-Western. So you gotta think it deeper if you want to publish it for people to look at it, because at first glance you will know that it's tilted towards that. So that indicator will not really fly that much. Humanitarian assistance is more in non-Western. And the NGOs work there more than they work in Europe or America. And there's no conflicts in Europe and America as much as is there. So there's so much stuff. So just a recommendation, because you want us to give you feedback. If you look at it, it is already tilted to non-Western. So
the context already, you mean?
Yeah, it's
absolutely,
tilted to non-Western. So that indicator or that analysis based on that, which you are using to make inference and draw conclusions, it's already tilted. It's already biased. So you got to give it a deep think and see how to represent it more. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. But the insinuation is, should a conflict arise in a Western country, that the way that this analysis is done would not inform how we would expect access obstruction to emerge? Is that what is behind the concern?
No, the concern is the data feed. That's the concern. Relief Web is published more in the non-Western area because that's where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So if it's published more there, yes, I'd rather you don't use Western through non-Western. Maybe use conflict, non-conflict, or something like that. That in that way, it makes more sense than if you say Western, because a lot of people will just pick it and just take it like that and swallow it. But the context is already skewed from the beginning.
Yeah, use the word Western in terms of the scope of the context, the scope or the scope of the organizations that are included, or all of it?
I don't know how to explain it to you more. I mean, I think I'm a little bit, maybe somebody will follow so that you
I'm just trying to make sure I understand. We can also talk more in the break. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about myself. I'm glad you brought it up. I think, like even the statements you used, stating Western allied countries or wherever. Then you followed it with international humanitarian humanitarian organizations. I think we should qualify, we should define what that means. Is it Western international organizations or just organizations in general? So what I'm trying to say is that international organizations cannot be generalized to mean everybody when we know we're talking about Western international organizations.
Yeah.
And that is where we're missing the point. There could be organizations from Russia, from Afghanistan, or from within Nigeria, but we are not, this context is not talking about those.
Yeah.
But we are very clear when we talk about Western allied or non-Western allied. That was very clear, but when the moment we talk about international relief agencies, we're generalizing, but we mean, I know we mean Western allied agencies, and that's where I think that need to be very clarified because it cannot be generalized. And the second thing, I think within the countries, the kinds of obstructions, I like how you tabled them. I think there were 3 kinds of obstructions. That was really amazing. But coming from Africa myself, I'm just thinking how police, or military, collect bribes and put roadblocks, or even give you access, then eventually turn back to come and create different groups. You know, the general takes money, the other one takes money. You really have different levels of obstruction. Really, I think really breaking that kind of obstruction beyond just superfluous level would be really helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you for your comments on that one. It is included. If there was a bribe or some kind of road blockage, it's included in the data set. As long as it specifies that it was the government that did it, as long as it specifies that it's an international Western organization that did it. But you're right that this data set is only incorporating data related to international Western humanitarian organizations. So if I said in the presentation international organizations specifying, not specifying Western, then that was, that's not what I meant. I do think that some of the same findings might apply to non-Western international organizations and even non-international organizations as well. But you're right that the precision about that is important. So thank you for that comment. I saw Jake, and then I'll go over here, and then I'll go over there.
The basis upon which you made that determination about arms sales, right? To me, that's where that one becomes a little bit problematic for me. I'm just wondering, either one, is there an alternative methodology you could use to identify aligned versus not aligned? Or you could reframe it as, is there a Western state party to the conflict? I'm thinking about a Nigeria or an Egypt or an Iraq where there's certainly a lot of arms sales, but I would question whether or not we would consider the Nigerian government to be Western aligned. So that would be one thing, is either thinking about the determination by which you make that distinction or just coming up with a different terminology, because I think that would alleviate some of the concerns about it. The other thing and this is a correlation causation problem, but the last slide you showed where you talked about conflict-related deaths, to me, I would love to see that in the initial bar graph thing. When intensity of an armed conflict rises, is that where, how much of the obstruction exists, and is there some sort of tipping point? And you can't really, it's hard to draw the lesson, because as the intensity increases, a lot more humanitarian organizations show up, puts a lot more pressure on a host government. So it may not be they're obstructing intentionally, it may just be a reality of the humanitarian context. But I would like to see that bar graph in some way. I'm not a data guy, so I trust you to make that.
Thank you. I can show you that bar graph. Not right now, I don't have it now, but I can produce that bar graph. But on the, I do not think that the reason that you see that correlation is because there are more humanitarian organizations operating. I don't think that's the reason. One thing I can show you in the regression is funding. As the scale of funding goes up, the funding for international humanitarian response goes up, has no impact on the scale of humanitarian access obstruction. I think we would see, if that was the issue, that we would see that as the funding goes up, there are more humanitarian operations going on, we would see more humanitarian access obstruction. We do not see that same correlation with funding. We see it with battle-related deaths. But I take your point on the terminology of Western, non-Western. Clearly, people are seeing that they want me to rephrase it or look at it in a different way. So it's definitely something for me to think about. Okay, I forget who I said I would go to, but I think I'll go here and then there. Okay, WFP, what do you got for me? Do you want to say it at the same time?
1, 2, 3, no. I think, so first of all, thanks for this, and I know that you and I talked about this a few months ago, and I'd be curious to see kind of, my question is the same. I think for UN agencies, very few of us, I think, would really be explicit in an external document to mention that the host government that is essentially hosting us and approves for us to be there is effectively, you go after, is effectively kind of imposing an access constraint, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering, like, you, at the time you told me actually you'd be surprised as to how many have actually put that in writing on Relief Web or in a document that is considered external. I know that as WFP we'd be extremely hesitant to do that. So I'm wondering if there has been, like, as your research has progressed, have you found actually more people be open about that? Or have you maybe seen a difference between, like, maybe in the interviews, if they're anonymous, they're candid about it, and then in writing actually no? Like, is there a big discrepancy?
Well, so for sure there's a big discrepancy between what you'll find in a public report and what I will find if I interview someone. But in terms of the comparative analysis, that type of discrepancy is okay. The purpose of using what has been reported publicly as a comparative scale is not to get what the full access picture is in the country. It's just to get a sense of how that picture compares to another context. So it is true that there are a bunch of reports that, many of them UN reports that do specify the government did something to obstruct access, mentions the organization or type of organization impacted. But I do assume that I am not getting all of the access obstruction in that context. I'm assuming that in order for it to be stated publicly in that way in a report, it needs to be very bad. So that is okay as far as the comparative analysis. What would bias the results is if the gap between what is publicly reported and what is not is in some way not completely consistent across contexts in a way that biases the result. Hopefully that makes sense. Does that make sense?
No, that makes complete sense.
Okay, I don't think it made sense to Colin completely.
You might have both, though. I think you will definitely have, like, a difference in how candid some organizations, depending on their nature, are in terms of facing these challenges. But also I can tell you that, like, how much WFP could report on Ukraine versus how much WFP reports in Nigeria versus how much WFP reports in Senegal is different. And this varies in terms of, like, time, like how many of these sit reps are getting on Relief Web, how many of them are reaching it, who is posting it, what the context. So
rotations in staff.
Rotations in staff.
Which is gonna change your temporal portion.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if there might be both.
Yeah, no, it is for sure true that there's going to be a lot of noise in the data. I don't think there's any way around there being noise in the data if you're trying to make a humanitarian access data set. But yeah, I take your point. But that is sort of why I try to think about it as crude but correct. It's not as specific. I'm not breaking it down by organization. I'm not trying to grab like get a picture of every access obstruction incident in the country. I'm just trying to get some type of comparative scale. But anyway, I take your point, and I will be interested to talk with you more about it afterwards as well. Okay, over here.
My name is Laura Sanan. I'm the Global Access Advisor for UNICEF. And I just spent a few years also with OCHA working on access analysis and all in different contexts, so I can really appreciate how difficult it is to actually put together an analysis that is going to not only reflect like the kind of access picture in a country, but also going to support the goals while you're actually analyzing and putting those types of analysis outside in the open on Relief Web, etc. What I wanted to say, and piggybacking on what my colleague just said there, I think that in the field, what is quite interesting right now is that access practitioners are trying to stay away from accountability and naming perpetrators and like trying and try to de-link the two, because if you link those two topics too much, it's very difficult to negotiate access basically, right? And so it's something that we've been pushed to do in many different contexts, especially the highly politicized context. Something that we try to move away from, and sometimes not for a good reason either, right? So it's not to say like we're not really good sometimes at underlying like clear red lines that have been crossed, etc., etc. But I think it is becoming increasingly difficult to negotiate in a humanitarian space in given context if you are linking the whole access issues with accountability, human rights, perpetration, etc.
Yeah.
And I think that's really something that when you negotiate access in a given context, it is on your mind like every single day, right? So you might have perpetrators and names linked to incidents as Yuri was saying, like in kind of hidden databases or like databases that you only want to use internally to link it for maybe specific advocacy purposes that will not be super official via Relief Web at all, but like in bilateral engagement, for instance, at different levels. That's one way that is being used at the moment to actually try to negotiate access in an environment where the humanitarian space is shrinking in very different contexts right now, right? Another point I just wanted to make on the obstructions, you're focusing on obstructions, which is like understood. I think that sometimes we shouldn't forget that some of the physical access constraints that we define as, you know, the road network, telephone, telecommunication networks and all, can also be used as certain government authorities are ways to cut people off from assistance or like reduce assistance to certain part of the countries, certain minorities, certain areas and all.
Yeah.
So these one.
Yeah, I totally take that point. In an earlier iteration of this data set, I was including issues of infrastructure, whether it's transportation infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure. It just got a little too messy and a little too like ambiguous about, oh, does this count as the government intentionally not fixing a road or intentionally delaying negotiation about repairing the bridge in Ukraine? So that's why I took it out, to try to eliminate that possible bias. But totally take your point. Okay. Well. Catherine?
Okay, so a couple of points. One, when you talk about battle-related deaths, are you talking about military deaths? Are you talking about civilian deaths? Or are you talking about both? Because it actually might be very interesting on a side, like if there's a huge rise of civilian deaths, does that also mean, or actually other issues like what Laura was also saying of other like violations, because you could assume that they wouldn't want Western organizations to be there because perhaps they may be more likely to feed information outwards about what's going on, which is why I also think it would be interesting to look at not just Western, but national organizations and how they are also obstructed from doing service provision. I think that's important. And maybe this is a less of an issue, but under international law, if the population actually has access to services, then the governments can say no to international assistance. So I assume that that is already the case if it's a non-issue with the cases you're looking at, but still, it's under law, they could refuse, and so they could make it very difficult if, you know, the people have access to services. So it's just an issue there. So those are the 3 points I kind of wanted to raise, because when you're coming out, you're trying to make an understanding in one way or another, trying to judge something. So you kind of have to have a slightly more holistic view to compare and cross-compare things to be able to try to make an analysis as to maybe why this is happening or how that might guide analysis or thoughts in something that, you know, that would use the data later.
Yeah. Let me say a few words about things you just said. So battle-related deaths, here we get to something where some people in this room might not agree with how political scientists have coded this. This comes from an existing data set. I didn't create this data set. But battle-related deaths is military deaths, but it is also civilian deaths from civilians that were killed in a military attack that was intending to target a military object. So the coders have tried to make that determination. There's a separate data set called the one-sided violence data set from the same organizations that created this data set. One-sided violence captures or intends to capture incidents in which militaries or non-state armed groups have intentionally targeted civilians. So I haven't shown, like, could be interesting to compare levels of humanitarian access obstruction with the extent to which the same actors are targeting civilians. But that's what the value is. On national humanitarian organizations, I absolutely agree it is incredibly important to look at what national organizations are facing and look at access obstruction there. It wasn't possible to do in this methodology in the way I was doing it. So looking at international organizations and specifically Western international humanitarian organizations is a starting point. But I agree that that's very important. On the law thing as well, completely take a note. Maybe I should specify that more clearly, that I'm not, these incidents in the data set are not necessarily incidents in which a government is, violating IHL by obstructing access. It just means it's incidents when international Western humanitarian organizations have tried to do something and have not been allowed to by the government. But you're absolutely right that in some cases that might be a gray area, or it might be okay under IHL. All right, we have 1 more minute left, I'm told. And I know we have many more questions, so if people, I do want people to ask me questions afterwards. I'll be around if you want to. It will be very helpful for me to hear your thoughts, but let's do 1 more question back there.
So first question is how to define the government's obstruction? What constitutes the obstruction? Because obstruction by non-state actor could also be counted on the relief wave as obstruction. So how to define what constitutes obstruction by the government? Second question is, because there will be 2 different, so in the situation of conflict and earthquakes or humanitarian situation, obstruction will be different. So then the counting would be, because if the government is seen as more obstructing, or the humanitarian agencies are obstructing by the government, that would be maybe 2 different things. Third, if the angry locals block the road, would that count as a government or as a, how do you count that?
Sorry, what was the third one?
Angry locals block the road or something, let's say.
If locals block the road?
Block the road.
Okay. So if I'll try to get to them all. So if locals block the road, it doesn't count as obstruction unless the report clarifies that it's somehow a government, if it's a government blocking the road. If so, yes, it counts as obstruction under the coding for this data set. The first, sorry, I've completely blanked on your points. The definition, what constitutes obstruction? So it just needs to be that a Western international humanitarian organization is trying to do something that the government is not allowing it to do in some way. So it's a narrowly confined definition, as opposed to there might be a more expansive way that you can look at it.
The government can say no in case of, let's say, that they think the agency is not registered, doesn't seem like time with
Right.
problems, or that's why, so they can still say no.
Right.
For safety reasons, so that still constitute.
Oh, yeah, I see. So in the data set, I did not make a distinction between those two. Sort of like infrastructure, even those issues can get a bit muddy. Like, oh, is this legitimate? Like, maybe the NGO did something really messed up, so they're getting kicked out of the country. Maybe it's a pretext that the government is using to kick the NGO out of the country. So they are included in the data set, but I don't try to disaggregate between, like, what is a legitimate kicking an NGO out versus a not legitimate kicking the NGO out. All right, we're at time. I'm getting the 0 sign from Alexandria. So please, again, I want to hear more from you if you have more questions that you want to ask or critiques or things you want to talk to me about what I did. Thank you so much for your feedback. Really appreciate it.
My laptop's just slow.
It's cool. So when I want to.
Yeah, so when you want to move the slide forward, you can either click that or you can just hit that. So you can go like that or like that. So just, you can advance it like that. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Where do I expand it?
Yeah, I'll introduce.
Yeah.
Would you like it, yeah, that just closes the presentation. Is that, does that look okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, everyone. So we are moving into our last presentation by Major Ebenezer Menlah, and it is titled "A Micro-Study of UNMISS Contribution to Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict, a Case of Leer, South Sudan." And thank you very much. Yeah, let's just use that.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon. I'm Ebenezer from the Ghana Armed Forces, and my research presentation will be a case study. So the research is giving a perspective of moving down the hierarchy from the headquarters level and then coming down to perspective with armed groups, warring factions, NGOs, all operating within the same environment. There's some few selected quotes. So this is from the David Shearer, the CHRHS, and he was responding to a reaction by peacekeepers. So when he said, this was when peacekeepers were able to repel government-instigated attack on the temporary protected area where IDPs were located. And that according to from what he said peacekeepers reacted in the best possible manner according to the true spirit of peacekeeping. Their quick defensive action secured the safety of all internally displaced people who had sought UN protection adjacent to the US base. And an aid worker also made a comment that thanks to UNMISS, it is safe to move and able to reach 100 to 300 children and lactating mothers. And from a lactating mother, he also mentioned that the UN did something good, very good for us all who delivered here. Many thanks to the UN peacekeepers for saving my life and my child. My baby is now healthy and growing very well. And the last but not the least, this is from the medical officer who said it is incredibly sad to see people dying when you can provide medical health care to them, assist them. And he was the medical officer who initiated assistance to IDPs, women and then adolescent mothers who were desperately in need of assistance for them to deliver safely. In the way of outline, this would be the order of presentation. So background of the study. Leer is the birthplace of Dr. Rick Marshall. He's the first vice president of South Sudan. And for the political system, South Sudan had 5 different vice presidents. He's a NOAA and then the main opposition leader. He's also the leader of the breakaway group, which is the South Sudanese People's Liberation Army in opposition. Looking at the background, so there's Leer, that is where the UN peacekeeping base is, and then scattered across is ICRC, MSF, and then the whole protected area, looking at the distance from Leer to a place like Padie, which is about 17.5 kilometers, UN peacekeepers are supposed to keep all these locations and operate generally around this location. By May 2015, about 1,200 civilians have been killed in the conflict, with over 1,400 females raped, and then abduction, which is also very common, about 1,630 abductees. The conflict created a kind of settlement known as the protection of civilian sites, which is similar to what happens in the Balkans, but in terms of operationalization and size, this was far the biggest. So on the screen is the picture of the peacekeeping position and that of the POC site, which was hosting the internally displaced persons. By way of the conflict aftermath, it has led to the displacement of about 4,500,000 are displaced, including 2,500 refugees who are moved into neighboring countries. It has led to over 400,000 deaths, and including 115 aid worker deaths. This is 5 years into the conflict. So at the one stage of the conflict, it was estimated that over 200,000 internally displaced persons were in the IDP camp. And between the movements, in and out movements within the IDP camp, is estimated to be over 1 million. What does this research seek to solve? So some implementation measures have failed to protect civilians, such as in Bor, Malacca, and then in Juba. Additionally, the responsibility of the host government and combatant to protect civilians per the Geneva Convention has also failed to live up to expectation. Since protection of civilians hinges on the credibility of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, UNMISS must be seen to implement strategies in consonance with the UN mandate in the protection of civilians. So the study objective: to assess UNMISS' contribution to the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, specifically to assess the approach to civilian protection, the effectiveness or the impact that the protection measures had in relation to the mandate, and then also state some few challenges in the operationalization of the protection of civilian mandates. I'll seek to answer the following questions. What is UNMISS' role in the protection of civilians in armed conflicts? Do peacekeepers respond to government-instigated violence? And what are the guiding principles that define peacekeepers' involvement in humanitarian response? And then some existing constraints in the protection of civilians in conflict, looking at Leer as the case study. So in terms of study design, I'm doing a qualitative research. The study site is Leer County, South Sudan. Study population include IDPs, humanitarian organizations, NGOs, warring factions, peacekeepers, and UN civil staff. The data used was between 2013 and 2020. And then I'm doing a qualitative analysis with some, in way of data collection method, there was key informant interviews, existing records from humanitarian organizations, the UN mission, the United Nations itself, and then also through personal observation. So what were the findings? So study outcome one, using force to protect. In May 2017, peacekeepers repaired small arms attack when the protection of civilian sites came under attack from the government forces. So similarly, on 4th and 8th June 2018, similar incidents also occurred when peacekeepers and then the integrated UNMISS team were around on patrols trying to get documentation and then validation on some of the international humanitarian law and then international human rights law violations. There was also a government-instigated attack from militias that were aligned to the government. And peacekeepers had to engage with exchange of fire with the militias aligned to the government. From the introduction, we realized a lot of aid workers have unfortunately lost their lives through provision of assistance to affected communities and then the IDPs. 17 aid workers who were 9 working for UNIDO and 8 with the Samaritan Purse International at the heat of the May to June conflict in 2018 were also rescued when they were locked up in the midst of the conflict. This was through a very determined intervention by the peacekeepers when they received very little or very timely information for them to be able to respond to rescue these aid workers. The situation is almost such that, unlike other conflicts that we have witnessed, for South Sudan, humanitarian organizations actually have limited choice, but to provide humanitarian assistance even to IDPs who are co-located in the peacekeeping bases. That was the scenario that the conflict created. So UNMISS bases served as a safe haven for humanitarian supplies and then shelter. In times when the conflict becomes very intense, it is the basis that the humanitarian organizations come in and then are able to provide assistance, especially on those victims who had gone through violations, especially for the girls who have been raped. That is where the organizations come in and then come and provide counseling because of the situation there. So from the case study, it was seen that peacekeepers were able to use force to protect civilians, protect civilian assets and the humanitarian organization in order to ensure the implementation of the mandate. So protection through non-use of force. After the signing of the Refertilizer Agreement, although not much was seen at the national level, progress was made at the local level through the commitment and reconciliation of hostilities between the belligerent parties, NGOs, various religious groups and youth groups, and then women groups. The first of such conference was held in front of the TOB, that is the protected area, the peacekeeping base, due to security and then safety reasons. There was also military humanitarian coordination, as others have stated. So basically, because the intensity of the conflict was such that most of the NGOs were not able to stay, the military has to come in, the peacekeepers have to come in and directly provide assistance to internally displaced persons who were just adjacent to the base or co-located in the base. So in a situation where it becomes very severe or unbearable for peacekeepers to hold on to, because peacekeepers were operating a UN level 1 hospital. So there's a coordination with MSF or ICRC for medical evacuation. And then they also joined forces with the UN civilian staff to do the ceasefire monitoring and verification of IHL and then IHRL violations. Most importantly, shaping the civilian health. So peacekeepers extended health care to desperately needed pregnant women and adolescent IDPs. For a 3-year period, due to lack of access and providers, South Sudan recorded one of the worst health outcomes in the world. So for instance, in South Sudan, 789 South Sudanese mothers die for every 100,000 live births. While neonatal and under 5 mortality rate stood at 39.3 and then 99.2% per every 1,000 live births respectively. So within a 3-year period, the base was able to provide assistance to desperately needed pregnant women and adolescent IDPs. So in all, between 2017 and then 2018, 90 babies were delivered at the TOB. I must also add that the TOB operated 120 peacekeepers with no midwife attached. So basically, it was for the doctors and then the medical doctors, the nurses, and the lab officer based at the base who were able to were the ones who provided this support to the pregnant women. Some few challenges were also encountered. So, for instance, lack of accountability mechanism, inadequate manpower, and then logistics. From the initial image that was shown, 122 were supposed to operate in a very large area, which was almost not possible. And then also, there was also poor in-house information and weak communication between aid agencies and peacekeepers. So we realized that once some of them have been caught in the conflict, the information reaching out to peacekeepers was very low. At the local level or down the hierarchy, the cooperation between the two is not very formal. So relationships are established based on those operating at the base and then the NGOs directly. Not any formal documentation exists between the peacekeepers and then the NGOs. And then ability to be able to identify legitimate civilians from militias supporting armed groups. So the situation was such that militias who are fighting for the breakaway SPLA group, on the next stage, you see them also fighting on behalf of the government forces. And then tomorrow he's an IDP. The next day he's in arms, also engaging in the fight. And this was one of the challenges that was identified in the studies. So the use of force to protect civilians and the mandate as per the rules of engagement to ensure the lives of civilians under threats of physical violence are protected. So in the discussion, you realize that peacekeepers do not hesitate to use force to protect civilians, as it's happening in Bo and then also in Juba. Also, supporting the peace consolidation efforts after the signing of revitalized peace agreement was also helpful in achieving local peace. So though no much progress was seen at the national level, reconciliation and commitment to cease all forms of hostilities was evident in Leer County. And this was evident when, after a count by DRC, you realized that the population at the TPA have moved from 2,500 to about 540 after the signing of the revitalized peace agreement. It's also important to note that peacekeepers protection of civilian rule extended beyond provision of security to shaping the civilian health and creating access in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. In conclusion, contrary to the situation in Malacca, Bo, and Juba, where civilians felt unsafe under UNMISS protection, the situation in Leer was that of a positive sense of security, specifically deterring government-instigated attacks on civilians, facilitating peace engagement, and then rescued humanitarian actors who were caught in the heat of the conflict. Also supported aid agencies in securing their safety and creating access in delivering humanitarian assistance. Peacekeepers also extended emergency medical services to civilian population, especially in assisting pregnant women and adolescent IDPs deliver safely. Recommendations and future studies. So several challenges that need to be confronted include capacity, political will, and then commitment. The views of affected communities also matter and should be made aware of the mandates and role of the peace support operation. This was evidently seen when the NGOs who were providing services left. Internally displaced persons wanted peacekeepers to provide almost everything as the NGOs were doing for them. And with the limited resources, it was basically not possible for us to do that. And the mission should focus on support for security sector reform, disarmament and reintegration process to transform the South Sudanese People's Defense Force and the breakaway South Sudanese People's Liberation Army in opposition into a professional national army. This is very crucial as currently we are observing in main Sudan. So this will actually help in the reoccurrence of the conflict. An independent or democratic state, it's not possible for them to have two separate standing armies. Military and aid agencies should also establish procedures that keep communication channels open during increased conflict. And by way of future studies, UN missions and little attention to reintegration, ethics of peacekeepers' involvement in humanitarian assistance, strengthening information sharing and intelligence analysis in CIMIC at all levels, and then POC sites beyond military protection. Thank you very much.
What are some of the ethical problems so between peacekeepers and humanitarian assistance?
So let me go on when we were helping the female IDPs to deliver, we realized that when they give birth, you are not supposed to watch them. So we are coming from a setting where when a child is born, the nurse will take the child and then give him a first wash. But for them, they keep the baby after 4 days before they bath them. So those were some of the ethical. Initially, we didn't know. So when you try attempting to even clean, it wasn't very pleasant. So that was one of the things that. And then also when we decided that it is no longer, we cannot provide the assistance because the support was very low. So for instance, there was no anything like blood for us to be helped with transfusion when there's excessive bleeding. So when we said we can no longer do that, they said no, they will deliver in front of the base. So there was a situation where we needed to quickly bring the woman in because he was almost delivering at the front, in front of the base. So those are some of the ethical challenges that confronted us, to do or not to do. Because it was something that we decided, it came out of a lot of conversation for us to accept that we should provide those assistance to the internally displaced pregnant women and the adolescent girls.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. The case of Leer, that was only the area of operations of the Ghanaian battalion, correct?
No, so the headquarters was located at Bentu. That's where the headquarters was located. So Leer was the forward position. That was the only forward position of the Ghanaian battalion.
Okay, but Leer, there was only the Ghanaians?
Yes, only Ghanaians. Only Ghanaians.
Okay. Yeah. Then the questions are, in the location that they showed as failures of POC, were there other troops there or there were no troops? And is there any difference in that? And related to that, the Ghanaians are, they have a good reputation in peacekeeping operation in different missions, right? So they're known for doing a good job. That's not the same for other contingents. So do you think that's a difference in how the Ghanaians did POC versus other contingents? And the third question, you were deployed there. So you're biased in what you're writing. You're still active duty, I think, right? So then, and how does this biases, how do you deal with these biases in your research?
So on the first question, initially during the onslaught in Juba, in Bo, and in Malacca, it was rapid. Yes, UN had a deployment there, but at that time, the mandate was not very clear. So, for instance, they were taking a bit of surprise. And Uganda were deployed in Juba, the Ugandan forces. And because they were more or less have close ally with the president, they more or less were a bit hesitant to respond to the government attack. Yeah. And then, yes, for our reputation, yes, is there. I think for Ghana, we provide almost about 40% contribution to generally the UN mission across the globe. And in terms of biases, not that when we were there, there was no any occurrences. Yes, in the full paper, there were some occurrences that did occur. And it is such that you don't have very clear authorization to respond unless it is under attack. So for instance, we responded, the response on the government-gated attack was directly against the POC, which is by the base. So that was why we needed to respond. So all the response cases, it was in direct confrontation with the government forces because more or less the attack was directly also on you. Yeah. So with the, yes, so on the second one, there's, how do I put it? There's a lot of pre-deployment preparation before you are set into the mission area. Yes, and various trainings are provided from different groups, including those experienced in the military area, and then also some NGOs also come in to provide those assistance, about 9 weeks, 7 to 9 weeks of training before you are set into the mission. Yeah, I think that is what is accounting for most of the successes. Yeah. Hello.
Hi, thanks. I have a few thoughts that I have noted down. I wanted to share them with you. Well, my name is Christina. I work for OCHA, but I was in UNMISS actually for a while, so a lot of it resonates with me, but I'm looking at it now from the humanitarian perspective. So the first one was on the concept of the POC. I think it's super interesting to look at UNMISS and try to identify some lessons. But to my knowledge, the POC camps were set up only to provide that military protection, right? And then a decade later, they've become something else, and UNMISS is managing camps, trying to uphold certain humanitarian standards. And I wonder how that works. Are those, protection standards being complied with? Is there any assurance? Health, education, safe spaces for women. Like, what does it mean to have a camp that protects civilians, that was conceived for military protection, but now ends up, building, it's a livelihood, it's a lifestyle for many people, and there is no relocation from these people. We're not rebuilding their towns because they are in these camps. So I wonder how it works internally in terms of humanitarian services that you provide, or how do you link with other organizations to make those assurances happen. Then you mentioned the protection of humanitarian staff, which it's great. I mean, yeah, as a civilian, it was great to have UNMISS. It's a huge organization. But you haven't really touched on the people that UNMISS cannot save, particularly looking at the 2016, how do I put it, entry into the UNMISS compound, and what was it that didn't allow UNMISS to protect the civilians and the humanitarians that were impacted? What are the limitations of this mission? Why did they fail in certain instances to protect us? And is it even because we are co-located? What is the impact on humanitarians of having that UN mission with so many contingents and so many military personnel? On a more positive light, I also would be super interested to know how UNMISS enables humanitarian operations. So all that coordination that is happening on how many humanitarian missions only happen because we can hop into UNMISS convoys. And maybe you have data on that, but I personally think it would be interesting to know how does this model work for us in terms of armed escorts, or maybe patrolling the roads and then creating a safer environment for us. And then I also wanted to say, you mentioned monitoring of IHL and other missions that are a bit sensitive for us. Of course, we're always talking about the humanitarian principles. It doesn't always benefit the humanitarian community that UNMISS is conducting this type of patrols, as you might know. So I just wonder how much of that dialogue have you experienced with humanitarians to come to an agreement on where your mandate is impacting ours and where your mandate has to stop? Because from my experience, there was a bit of a fight for mandate space, where UNMISS would be like, no, but I have to do this as well, regardless of whether it's impacting us. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me start from the last one so I don't forget. So, for instance, at Leer, ICRC were helping farmers with seeds, and unfortunately, the one who was in charge of their security was shot. The POC, the base quickly have to come in and then provide assistance. Then after that, there was evacuation, which means that the whole humanitarian program has been cancelled. So for that rainy season, there's not going to be seed for farmers to plant. So for me, I think the imperative should be in assisting those who are in need. Whether it is possible for peacekeepers to provide that assistance or to provide those support, as long as you are not interfering. And where there's an interference, you come in and then there's a form of coordination to be able to have a mutual consensus as to how to go. Yes. So from what the example that I gave, which means that when there was the evacuation, then it means the whole program has ended. There's no longer ICRC. They have to wait for everything to settle before they come in. So the humanitarian imperative should be the common goal, either you're a peacekeeper or you're a humanitarian organization. And then with the fieldworks, so like I said, UNMISS was not ready. The mandate itself didn't prepare the peacekeepers for them to engage. And sometimes, depending on the relationship, it's also at the national level. The relationship between the states, the two states who are involved, then they refuse to engage, then the logistics. So for instance, when the humanitarian organizations went into Juba for them to be protected, the peacekeepers, they closed their doors. They said, no, we can't assist. because there was no clear direction as to what they are supposed to do in case of this to happen. So after 2016, 2017, there was clear change of the mandate for peacekeepers to now provide protection and then also provide the means in delivering humanitarian assistance. In terms of collaboration, the situation of Leer was a bit unique, unlike what is happening in Juba. So in Juba, for instance, the NGOs go straight into the POC site to provide the assistance. And some of the challenge was that there were some also, they virtually moved the conflict also into the POC site. Yes, and for those in the site, they had their own private security to give them protection. But then the peacekeepers go in to go and then assist with barriers and the rest. With the IDPs going for their firewood collections and all those, yes, so that armed groups do not pounce on them and then abuse or rape them. Yes. So basically, that is how I'll put it. Are there any more? Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
I was also doing messing wow, so it's related with about what you mentioned. So quick question was, so besides Leer, I think there was so many other in WoW, in Tomping, in Equatoria, so I don't know if that was compared between the situation in Leer versus the other sites where other battalions were NIFBAT were protective protections. So I was wondering because this the military was basically providing protection, whereas other sections were doing the other services like the INGU, the subtended sections, they would come and give the services. So I think military was more focused on the protection of the site and the area. But I was curious about the person being civilian today, tomorrow he's a part of the group. So he comes and goes, then the arms are inside the POC, then there is then fighting. So how was their situation in Leer in case of that definition? Yeah. How was that?
So in Leer, for instance, it was very direct. So basically, peacekeepers have to involve in almost everything, in providing water, providing healthcare, providing protection, and all. And then for their entry points, there's an OP. Operational, yes, there's an operational post there overlooking. There's 2 operational posts that is overlooking the camp. So like I said, it's basically the military base. Yes, so that was how we were able to assist. And then for the humanitarian organizations to go in, there's this collaboration. I don't know if because it was at the local level, it was not very formal with the documentation, but then there's the mutual understanding for various, for the two to come into understanding that the humanitarian imperative is paramount, so that the assistance are provided, yes. But then some organizations are not comfortable with that. Unfortunately, some were, due to that, they are located far away from the peacekeeping base, and when there was, when the conflict was, the intensity of the conflict increased, they suffered some casualties, yes. And then later on, they had to come in and to the base for protection. Yeah. Thank you very much for